I don't know about you, but there are some times when I become very frustrated with technology. This is an old movie called Office Space, where 3 employees conspired to steal some money from the organization. But before they did that, they got a little frustrated with being workers in cubicles, and particularly frustrated when the technology didn't work. So there might be some days when you want to take a bat to your tablet or iPhone. These were, looks like they were beating up on an old printer there. Technology has influenced organizational communication to a great extent over the last since the beginning of organizations, but that influence has accelerated greatly, of course, in the last 30 years or so. In this lesson, what we will be talking about tonight is, or this morning, whenever you watch this lesson, we'll first define and identify some of the types of organizational communication technology, some that we use and some that we might not have even thought of as being technology that is useful to us as communicators. The second thing we'll do is examine organizational communication technology through the 4 lenses that we looked at and learned about last weekend. And then finally, we will look at suggestions for using communication technology. As we get going, though, I would like to ask you a couple of questions. The first question is, what is the most indispensable communication technology you use? What's the one piece of organizational communication technology, I should say, that you use on a daily basis that you just could not do without? For some of you, it may be the phone. For others of you, it might be a particular, say, social media application. For others, it might be a spreadsheet. Whatever it is, take a few moments, write it down. The second question, then, is what's the most infuriating communication technology you use in your organization? The one that just drives you nuts. I can tell you that over the past few days, there have been several communication technologies that have frustrated me, which is something I'll explain to you in an announcement when I explain where the lessons for this week are. Technology is more than just mobile phones, and I think you know that, but in this first section we'll define what technology is and some of the examples of technological tools that we use as communicators. Any tool that helps facilitate communication, the exchange of information and meaning, could be considered technology. That's from Cheney's long chapter on organizational communication technologies. In many respects, we could consider these as the channels used in the communication model that we explored a little bit last week. You might recall that for doing communication audits in your organizations, using the COM model, sources and receivers, messages, and channels, might be a way to narrow down the focus of what it is you're looking at. Certainly communication technology and the channels of communication, who uses them, what tools they use, what information they like to get through those tools, are important questions to ask if you suspect that if there is a problem in your organization related to, say, information overload, sources of information, and the flow of information in your organization. Cheney and his co-authors identified 4 major categories of technology for organizations, 4 of which influence the communication. The first is obviously communication technologies. Your mobile phone, email, social media, even things like newsletters and so on that directly transmit messages between people in the organization. The second major tool they identify in that chapter are decision-making technologies. These are tools that help people gather information, collect it in a way and organize it in a way that is useful to them in making decisions, and to use that data to, again, make decisions and influence what happens in the organization. You have undoubtedly heard of big data, and for most communication people, we are beginning to wrap our heads around what big data can do in terms of identifying trends among publics, consumer behavior, trends in politics and culture and tastes. And that's we need technology to help us make sense of that. That's the kind of thing we're talking about when we talk about decision-making technologies. The third kind of technology are networks of computers, your local area networks within the organization that links one computer to another. This seems pretty commonplace. And I will say this one and the next one you might not think of when you think of new emerging technology. I mean, networks of computers have been around practically since the first mainframes were created in the 40s and 50s. However, networks of computers and the final category, networks of networks, like the World Wide Web, are still emerging. We think of the really popular ones, like the local area networks that we have, real common ones, like the local area networks and organizations, and the World Wide Web, the Internet. But when you think of things like cybercurrency and the Bitcoin kind of currency that we were talking about in class the other day, those are new emerging networks of networks. It's also important to remember that many of the networks that were created originally were under the public's eye. That is, the public didn't really know that they were being created, know that they existed. And many of those networks still exist, and there are many more that have been developed since then. So, for instance, it was a group of military researchers and contractors who first created what became the World Wide Web, because they wanted to share information about the projects that they were working on. The first email messages, for instance, were sent over this network. That was approximately 30 years ago, a little bit more than that, and we're still watching cryptocurrency networks and other networks emerge that will bear watching, I guess. It sounds more like a warning than advice, but will bear our understanding as we try to make sense of how people are organizing themselves and sharing information. This is a list, a partial list, because we know that particularly with social media and digital media, many of these things are changing almost by the moment. But this is a partial list of some of the kinds of organizational communication tools or tactics that have been used over the years. It begins with the more commonplace traditional ones, print publications of one kind or another. You might think these are a little old-fashioned, but many organizations still send them out. LaSalle University, and more importantly, the network of Christian brothers that run and founded LaSalle and about 1,500 institutions around the world. They send out a magazine to keep people informed of what the organization is doing and to generate support from donors and other supporters. Progress reports and research reports, while they might not be the most exciting communication technology or tool that you use, they are very useful at identifying information that needs to be shared from subordinates to superiors and vice versa. Direct mail is used, and is a form of correspondence. We'll talk a little bit about that again in a couple of items. Catalogs of information in the organization, reference books, and those sorts of things. We turn a little bit to the digital tools, obviously the somewhat static ones like web pages or an intranet. And then the social media channels, YouTube, Pinterest, Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook, Yammer, which is a internal social media platform created by Microsoft. These are all being used increasingly in helping people form networks and community, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. You have your standard meetings, and a little bit below that, other forms of interpersonal contact, like walking into your boss's office and talking about things. We don't really think of technology being used with those sorts of interactions, but to set them up and to organize meetings and those sorts of things requires technology. And then finally, correspondence. Letters, emails, memos, those kinds of things. It did strike me as I reviewed this list that many organizations have their own internal television channels as well. Typically now that digital media is distributed over YouTube or Facebook or some sort of intranet portal, but the fact remains that there is a tool that's created much like TV programs or short television commercials are, to promote and to inform audiences, internal audiences, about what the organization is doing. I'd like you to take a moment and fill out the digital media questionnaire that can be found on this page in Canvas. The interesting thing about this questionnaire, it's a self-assessment about your skills in various forms of digital media, information gathering media, social media, and so on. The thing about this particular survey is that it was prepared by the EU as part of its workforce development program, and so people can fill this out to identify specific kinds of skills they have and kind of where they rank on those skills, so that when they're putting resumes together and answering questions during an interview, they can speak with a little bit more insight into the things they bring to the table. Thus, I thought it would be a good exercise for you to complete the questionnaire so you can identify your strengths as a digital communicator. So take a few minutes and fill that out now. You don't have to print it off. You can, it's not that long a questionnaire. You can essentially look at it and sort of identify what categories you would fall into each of the dimensions and types of digital media they use. The first, of course, is technology and structure. There are a number of ways in which organizational communication technology influences and is influenced by structure. The first thing is that there is a greater flow of messages and information up the organization, so from the lower level employees to higher level, down the organization and across. Not only just instructions and reports, but also feedback about things that are going well, suggestions for improvement, more information across the organization to coordinate activities and resources. You might recall that when we talked about structure last weekend, a couple of the authors wrote about the need to increase linkages across organizational units. It was relatively easy to cluster things and to group activities, but a lot harder sometimes, or a lot harder to remember anyway, to create a system for linking those units together. So communication technology has helped with that to a great extent. You'll see the note overload, though, and one of the great tragedies, I guess, of greater information flow is the fact that it overflows sometimes, that there is so much information flowing around organizations, and one might argue society today, that it's hard to understand what to pay attention to. It's hard to weed through all of the bits of information and ways that it gets delivered, email inboxes, for instance, that it becomes overwhelming sometimes. When I returned home from this trip, I checked my email in Prague before I took off. I checked my work email in Britain, in England, and had about 25 messages in the 2 hours it took me to make that flight. And by the time I returned to Philadelphia, I had over 50 messages in my inbox. Those were new messages from England, so in about 8 hours I had 50. A friend of mine made the 3-hour trip. He worked for Ford Motor Company at the time as a mid-level manager. He made the 3-hour trip from Detroit to Philadelphia, and he had over 100 messages waiting for him in his inbox when he arrived. And this was a few years ago. So the flow of information throughout organizations has gotten quite great, and there is a lot of advice out there about how to declutter your inbox and more efficiently go through your email. The other benefit, or the other impact on structure, is the new ability to form networks throughout the organization and beyond. We say social and professional here. I would argue for this course, professional and social networks. That is, you're able to develop connections among coworkers in ways that bears maybe little resemblance to the actual organizational structure and formal reporting relationships. However, we know that in any organization, the ability to get things done often relies on those people who know things. So our administrative assistant in our department knows more than a lot of other people do, and when we want something done, a lot of people sort of contact her about how to really get things done around the organization. That wouldn't happen as easily were it not for communication technology. And so a good manager or strategist in organizational communication should pay attention to how networks have formed throughout the organization. Who do people go to for information, accurate, trustworthy sources, and how technology helps facilitate that. One of the features, and it was a little hard to figure out which frame this really went with, so we'll talk about it here, but one of the features that Cheney identifies in the chapter on communication technology is the fact that different choices that we make regarding technology depends on, it will influence the kind of information we get. Not only the actual message, please fulfill this order by next Wednesday, but also the meaning behind the message, the context that helps people understand the message, the cues, C-U-E-S, that provide us with additional information about how the sender is feeling when they send the message, about what they expect us to do, and so on. In the book, in the chapter, the reading for this lesson, Cheney identifies sort of a continuum of channels that are spaced out based on how rich they are. A rich media outlet, a rich channel, means that there are lots of cues that give us information, and that those cues are unambiguous. That is, they're not open to a lot of interpretation. Other types of channels often tend to filter out the cues that are there, and so we're sometimes left with a little ambiguity in terms of what's happening, what something means, etc. So in this continuum, again taken from Cheney's chapter, a very unambiguous message, for the most part, is a fire alarm. When a fire alarm goes off, we know what we have to do. If you've gone through any fire drills, get up, get out of the building. Now, we don't always exactly know why a fire alarm goes off. So on my way home from Prague, I stopped in London, and the terminal was shut down for a little while, or at least one of the hallways in the terminal was shut down because the fire alarm was going, an emergency alarm. There were, in fact, fire personnel on the scene and some other official-looking people in uniforms and work suits and everything. We came to discover, and partly by sniffing the air, that it was really the cause of a sewage problem in one of the toilets in the terminal. So it wasn't really a fire, it was something else. Now, the cue that we got, and that most people got until the authorities showed up, was that there was an emergency and people needed to move out of that area. As we got more information from people talking to us and being filled in through other channels, we had more cues to figure out that, okay, this wasn't a very serious thing and it really wasn't a fire. As you work your way across the continuum, written memos and emails contain only text, so we can't really understand what the person is feeling on the other end of the line unless they type in all caps, and then we can imagine either their typewriter keyboard is broken or they're mad at us. Real-time web chat with text only, like texting, or some of the messenger applications, say in Facebook or Yahoo email used to have a messenger app that gives you some information and is relatively quick, but it also, and you have this back and forth where you can ask questions and things, but it is also missing some information. Telephone conversations are the same way. How often have you been on the phone with somebody and really been doing something else? There are a couple of funny videos about conference calls where you can see and hear sometimes that people are actually doing something quite different from attending the meeting that they're supposed to be attending. I'll try to share one of those clips on the page for this unit. A video conference gives you more information. You can actually see when people aren't paying attention and maybe looking at their phones and playing cards or something. But more importantly, you get more information about the state of mind of the receiver and the senders. But the richest of all the medium here is face-to-face. That you get all sorts of information about what people are thinking, what they are saying to you, how they're feeling, and can make some judgments about how to respond with a little bit more information. One of the things that technology promised to do as it became more popular, particularly email and information databases and that sort of thing, was to affect where decisions were made. After about 30, maybe 40 or 50 years of looking into this, there seemed to be two schools of thought still. On the one hand, there are a number of people who believe, and we're sort of hearkening back here to Fayol and Weber, that authority is more decentralized when you make a greater use of information technology and communication technology. So you put information in a database somewhere and give everybody access to it. That means everybody in the organization has the same information from which to make decisions. As some of you may have experienced in developing public relations campaigns and those sorts of things, even though everybody in the group might begin with the same kind of information and orientation to the problem or project, there are often very different ways in which they go about interpreting that information and creating something that is different from the person sitting next to them. So information available throughout the organization could lead to more creativity and decision making farther away from the center of the organization. The other thing related to decentralization is that new networks of people can make decisions further down the hierarchy. So there might be the sort of formal organization that has been created, but perhaps two branches of an organization in a particular state or region of a country decide that there's a problem that's unique to their region that they decide to begin collaborating on through using creating networks. Rather than going all the way up the hierarchy again, they build a bridge, Fayol's bridge or gangplank, and begin to coordinate in order to solve a particular need in their region, in their market. On the other side is the notion that technology might centralize information sharing and authority and decision making. Many organizations exert sort of centralized control over messages and content. We see this in public relations. Very rarely do organizations make a statement to the press that hasn't been approved and pre-authorized by somebody in the Office of Public Relations or the President's office or whatever, and all of that is very central to the organization. Even if the news or event happened to a branch or a part of the organization in another part of the world, We're going to talk a little bit more about this when we talk about power, because the control of information is also a way of exercising power in the organization. Finally, when we talk about technology and the structure of the organization, there are a couple of other points here. The first is increased coordination. There's many collaborative tools out there that allow people to put documents in place or information in that, and a group or a division can work together. Cloud technology has given us Google Docs. Wikis have allowed people, even Canvas is essentially a wiki, that if I gave you permission to do so, you could add to the pages that we have, provide additional examples, and so on. It also creates coordination both with the final way of looking at some of this, the impact of technology on structure, is by looking at the transition from organizations to organizing. The second frame through which we can consider technology is the human resources frame. There are a variety of ways in which technology can help motivate workers. For instance, technology can foster employee involvement and feedback. As we discussed a moment ago, the increasing use of technology helps information flow upward in the organization. So employees can give feedback to their bosses, offer suggestions, etc. There are a number of organizations that have set up anonymous message centers so that people can provide suggestions, highlight issues or problems. It's like the old suggestion boxes that used to be in factories and other workplaces. These are online and can be aggregated and collected by those a little further up the chain. The second way technology helps motivate workers is that it allows flexible scheduling and working at home. So the few of you who mentioned that one of the things you valued as a perk at your workplace were flexible working times, when you could come in, when you could leave, when you could work on projects, whether you had to come in at all, as long as you had your work completed. That is certainly one of the benefits. In a little while, we'll talk about how that becomes kind of a challenge, perhaps, for some workers. And then it's kind of cool to get new stuff, so that getting new technology is in fact a reward in itself. I was struck by one of the create an organization plans that to reward managers and executives, you gave them things like a new car, a company car, or a company mobile phone or laptop. Again, those are things that come with performing well, and if the organization can afford it, it's an awfully nice perk to have. While technology does a lot to sort of foster greater interaction, involvement, empowerment, engagement, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a different lesson, there are also some features of technology that in the human resources frame that have to do with being human. So for instance, while it's good to have the technology to manage your life and to work at home and be a little flexible about how you do your work, working at home means you're almost always on, at least potentially. I am constantly getting fussed at for checking my email before I go to bed. It's almost instinctive, particularly in these weeks when I have sort of two locations that I'm trying to manage here. But you can think of the different ways that if you can access information and tools that you need remotely, that it is not uncommon for a boss or somebody to ask you to do some extra work on a weekend. At least in the U.S., sort of sadly, more than 60% of employees and managers report that they bring information or communication technology with them on vacation so that they can keep up with things that are happening at work. And I am guilty of doing that as well. There is a big movement afoot, I believe, in the U.S. and elsewhere for work-life balance, and this is particularly true of millennials, that they want work so that they can earn money and be somewhat satisfied, but they look for fulfillment sort of outside of the work. Depending on the kind of position that you have, though, technology might impede on this, and so that the personal reward that you get from being able to spend time at home and be flexible is undercut a little bit by the constant intrusions of work. A number of years ago, back in around 1999 or so, a psychiatrist named Hallowell began to notice an increasing number of employees and managers, mid-level managers in businesses around New York where he practiced, coming to him with anxiety issues and depression. And as he probed it a little more and began to observe them at work, observe other people at work, he came to the conclusion that the use of technology was in fact isolating people to a certain extent. That, and in doing so, it increase their paranoia and anxiety. The examples that he used might seem a little quaint by our standards with smartphones and everything, but he was talking about being left out of an email chain, for instance, and you find out that this email had gone to several other employees about social function that was happening, and the manager who was reporting this said that he began to feel very anxious. Don't they like me? Am I losing ground here at work? Am I losing influence and power? Am I being cut out of other decisions like business decisions or projects that I might be involved in? And that person grew very anxious because of that. So increased technology use happens, seemingly increases anxiety. And there have been some studies of sort of non-organizational social media like Facebook, for the way that you and I mostly use Facebook. And particularly with the younger people who are really invested in social media, there seems to be an increase in social anxiety and feelings of self-worth and that sort of thing. So while there are some benefits to having technology from a human resources standpoint, it might also be creating some problems. And then the final thing, we talked a little bit about this in the previous frame, technology can replace humans. You might wind up with few people in your organization if technology continues to develop. The whole process of downsizing and laying off people and thinking that you might be replaced by a robot is very dehumanizing to people. They begin to build up, walls and defenses to kind of shield themselves from the emotional strain that comes from losing coworkers and other folks, and then to be replaced by a machine when you've been doing a job maybe for a number of years, that would be a pretty significant blow to people. The filmmaker Michael Moore, at least the United States filmmaker, he makes documentaries. One of the first ones he did chronicled the decline of Flint, Michigan, which was one of the biggest automotive car-making cities in the world. And General Motors closed a number of plants there over a series of years in the 80s. And then they built something called Auto World, which was kind of a museum to making cars. Moore thought it was ironic that they had this sort of happy auto worker singing a song about being replaced by a robot, almost sort of a love song to the robot who was replacing him, which he thought was just the weirdest thing ever. The museum itself closed after about 6 months of being open. Technology and culture is the next frame we'll look at. There are a number of ways, again, in which technology influences culture. It has led to more nimble, faster organizations so that speed has become a value. Efficiency has become a value for a lot of organizations, a lot of workplaces. This is okay to a certain extent, although if people can't keep up with the increased speed of information and the need to get things done, then that becomes a little bit of a challenge. But organizational life is generally picking up a little bit, even in places like banks or manufacturing firms where it's been traditionally been a slow-paced environment. But again, remember that culture is the celebration of values and the use of symbols, rituals, and rites to kind of reinforce those values. So if fast and speed is a value, then that influences the kind of people that are selected and the kind of ways that you make decisions. This is another item that was a little hard to place, but it's important about the way that technology influences organizations, and that's the rise of accelerated learning organizations and knowledge management. More and more organizations provide information and need information to provide services to other organizations. In some countries, manufacturing is still key, so there are many manufacturing plants, for example, in the Czech Republic. But in other places, it's more of an information and service economy. All of this, though, means that because of rapid changes in industries and in fields, organizations need to learn more quickly about how to adjust to what's going on around them. Information technology has helped this. And while it's somewhat related to the first point about being faster and more responsive, the key point here is that they learn. Much like children learn when they make a mistake or when they play a video game and have to go back and do a part over, they adjust to that. The rise of artificial intelligence, for instance, that allows organizations and machines to sort of adjust to what's happening around them is a symptom of this. Of course, people have to respond to change as well, and so they're using technology to allow them to do this. Technology, given that culture is largely symbolic, and it was the symbolic frame that we were looking at this through, culture is represented by symbols, and machines are a symbol. A nice computer is a status symbol. The use of social media that an organization has is also a status symbol. You're cool if you use the hottest, latest technology and social media that all the cool kids are using. So, early on in the days of the internet and World Wide Web, there are a lot of organizations that didn't have web pages. And people would say, what do you mean you don't have a web page? I mean, everybody has a web page. Well, there's some really good strategic reasons not to use a particular communication technology. Your audience might not read it or see it or like it or want it, but because everybody else is using it and you don't seem like you're cool if you don't have it, then you incorporate it as well. So hence the question, what do you mean you don't tweet? Well, some organizations don't need to tweet. Their publics don't read tweets. They're not on Twitter. And yet, because everybody else seems to be doing it, they have decided to do it as well. Another way in which culture is influenced by technology is in the role of new languages. A few years ago, there actually is, I discovered, an emoticon assembly that actually approves new emoticons and emojis to be used in social media. If you're looking for an interesting job after graduation, you too can be the person who invents the next emoji that gets used in Facebook Messenger or something. But to be serious for a moment, technology has influenced the rise of new language, both when using the technology and outside. My daughter will interject in the middle of conversation, LOL. It's like, do you mean that you're really supposed to be laughing out loud right now? And she said, yes, but I thought I'd do that. And it's like, okay, you could actually laugh, and that would be a good thing because I like your laugh, but no. She will just say LOL. We are developing sort of a set of hieroglyphics almost, much like ancient cave dwellers or the Egyptians, that are replacing language for some people. And that's an interesting transition to the next thing, that there's development for new rules for interaction and new rules for writing. A few years ago, it's not as popular anymore, there were actually guides to netiquette. And if you Google, speaking of how language has been influenced by technology, if you Google email etiquette, you'll get many guides to how you shouldn't flame people, that you shouldn't type in all caps, and so on. So there's new rules that govern the interaction that you have using these digital technologies. The one interesting thing about the use of social media, and this is in one of the readings that I asked you to look at for this unit, is how social media can help build community. Or, as the reading suggests, the community helps build social media. It was an interesting article that suggested that the emotional intelligence and the emotional quotient is as important as the technological aspect of communication channels. And I tend to agree with that, to be honest with you. That you need to have a good, strong culture, and that culture influences the appropriate use of social media. The authors concluded that good social media in organizations feature several characteristics. The first is authenticity. Social media content is consistent with actual conditions. We value our employees, but we're laying you off is not a consistent message. And so what a good organization would do would be to say, look, we want to be honest with you. Here's our financial situation. We're going to use social media to keep you connected with each other and resources to help you make the transition should we need to downsize the organization. There have been a number of instances when people have said one thing in social media but done a different thing in real life, and that just ruins the trust that employees have, but also certainly the authenticity. I like the way that the article develops a couple of case studies of organizations in each case. Another characteristic of a good culture, a good community, and social media can help this, is pride. That you work for a good place, so you're willing to back it up, cheer for it, talk about it in public. It's a good organization, and you want to show it off to other people. Social media allows you to do that outside of the organization. In organizational communication within the organization, you can use social media to share ideas and good things that your unit is doing, and perhaps inspire other people to do some of the same things. The third characteristic is attachment. That people are committed and want to be with the organization that they represent. They share the values. Again, the reason why you develop a strong culture is that everybody in the organization can share the values of the people that you're working with, make decisions that benefit both themselves and the organization, and is expected to act in a way that's consistent with what the organization would want you to do. Social media helps develop this, and it helps deepen the bonds between employees. This is really important for retention. In careers that last maybe 4 years in some organizations these days, if you can retain employees for longer than that, you don't have to train new people and those sorts of things. Social media can help you do that. And then it's fun. Good social media interaction is fun, as is a good community culture within an organization. You have the Friday afternoon wine tastings, or you go out bowling, or there's one of the latest trends in the U.S. is throwing a big axe, a hatchet, at something. They actually have indoor ranges where you can go and take a big axe and throw it at a wall and see if it sticks. There are work groups that are taking their teams of their employees to these areas to work out aggression, I think, but also to have kind of a fun bonding experience. LaSalle did that a couple of weeks ago. I wasn't able to make it. The point of this whole thing is culture, good community features these things as well. So your use of social media and any technology shouldn't just be an add-on, right? It should sort of flow from the kind of culture that you already have. If you're consistent, that leads to authenticity. If you are talking about good things happening in your organization, that helps with pride. If you help develop shared values and connections between people, that helps with attachment. And then you have a little fun while you're doing it. Those things make for a good work culture and also good social media use. So as you begin to plan the content that you might incorporate into social media, this might be something to keep in mind. The final frame that we'll look at is technology and power. And there's a variety of ways, again, in which technology influences this. Remember, again, that power is your ability to get someone to do something that they might not otherwise do, and that there were various bases for exercising power. Machines, and I should say technology, shape the use of power resources. So remember the bases of power and resource dependency that we spoke of last week. So for instance, machines and technology help make work more efficient and effective, or automate tasks. Frederick Taylor smiles every time a postage meter is used rather than licking a stamp and putting on an envelope. When you go to McDonald's and they just put a cup under a spigot and press a button and the proper amount of milkshake pours into the cup without them having to do anything other than push the button. Automated teller machines have replaced bankers. Voice menus replace communication with a real person, much to the frustration of almost everyone, I think. So all of these things have happened, and what happens in that case is if I can get a machine to do what you do, then I might not need you. And remember that one of the criteria for judging how strong you depend on something, how dependent you are in that resource dependency model, one of the factors is the extent to which the resource can be found elsewhere. So I gave the example of bus drivers in Philadelphia. If they can ever find or create self-driving buses, then it doesn't matter whether the workers go on strike or not. It doesn't matter whether the union demands higher wages or not. They'll just be fired. And here's a machine that doesn't need to take a vacation, doesn't ask for sick time or overtime. They're happy with what you pay them, so to speak. And so there are a lot of advantages to people. And that's a way of exercising power. If people are beginning to organize to protest something the organization is doing, there's a way that they might be able to take out, lessen the effect of the power that those people have. For many organizations, they use technology to control and monitor people. So while we think we have a lot of freedom in many of our societies, we also know that we're, in a lot of places, we're constantly monitored. There are closed-circuit cameras. There's a way to count keystrokes on a keypad. They time how long it is that you take to help a customer at a customer service desk. A few years ago, some researchers picked up on an architectural term called panopy, P-A-N-O-P-Y. And what a panopy is, or a panoptic design, it's one in which you put the central people in an organization and position them physically in a way so they can see everything that's going on. There is a prison in Philadelphia. It's not used anymore as a prison. It's a museum now. But it was one of the first panoptic buildings in the U.S. And one of the reasons, obviously, you want to do that in a prison before you had closed-circuit television is you wanted to be able to sit in the middle of the room and notice what's happening in all of the cells around you. So it was sort of like the spokes on a wheel. There was a central part, and then the spokes went out from that. Many people have taken that term and said this is what technology does in organizations. It allows kind of a panoptic effect wherein top management or mid-level management can look at almost everything their employees do. There is no real right to privacy in an organization. You don't own the email that's on the servers if your organization owns those servers. And this is going to be an increasingly important part of organizational communication law going forward, I think. The final thing here related to power is that information is power. If I know something you don't, and you need that information to do something you have to do, then I have some power over you. And so there is a lot of control and access and passwords and those sorts of things that bar people from looking at information that they think will really help them understand the organization better, but also might be something you steer clear from because people want to hold on to that information and lock it up so that only they have it and will dole it out in little pieces if they think you are worthy of getting that. So you need to be at least cautious about what information students or other people working in your organization have access to. Organizations, I will say, have put up very extensive measures to kind of protect the information they have, although in some of the big data breaches of the last several years, you kind of wonder how secure that really is. To conclude this lesson, and you're probably going not a minute too soon, we're going to talk a little bit about making technology work for you. There are just several suggestions, quick suggestions about how technology can work for you as a professional. The first is to use technology to really enhance communication and meaning. So if you're using a PowerPoint slide, for instance, and you have a lot of statistical information to convey, then design the technology, design the PowerPoint in a way that easily conveys that information. If you're sending out a big technical report, but you have a great graphic designer who can turn it into an infographic to communicate dense numbers, use the technology to help people understand and to increase the meaning that they attach to the messages that you create. Good, effective technology embraces the emotional component of work. I talked about the human moment, and the social media authors talked about the emotional quotient. The emotional content quotient related to the workplace, and how having a good sense of empathy and understanding other people's feelings will help the technology do what it's supposed to do, but also increase the level of interaction and feeling between workers. Understanding what those feelings are and using technology to help you sort of pull those out a little bit is an important use. The social media article is good about that. It requires training to do well. We have had in the past a writing class. You can take classes in designing web pages. Just because we noticed this, I noticed this a number of years ago when computers became cheaper, printers became better. A lot of people said, hey, we can make our newsletter on our computer. So rather than pay a graphic designer to go out and create a newsletter for us, and rather than pay for the printing and everything, we'll just get somebody here to do it. We'll get Bob over here in accounting to design the newsletter for us. Well, if the person hasn't had any training or orientation to doing it, then it's a mess. And Bob experiments with fonts and type sizes and everything, and the newsletter just looks a mess and doesn't do what it's supposed to. Same thing with Facebook. Just because you know how to use Facebook, you post it a lot yourself, doesn't mean you know how to use it strategically. Which audiences, at which time, and what content do you put up there without angering people? Any sort of social media is the same way. And so you need to be, at least concerned about these, getting the training that you need to do this stuff well. Often information needs to be, this is the last point about using technology effectively. Just because you can share information, again, doesn't mean you can share it well. And so sometimes you have to frame the information, both in the way that you present it and in the technology you use to present it, in a way that is useful and understandable to people. There have been several glaring errors in presenting information to people, where they thought one thing and they made a horrible assumption about what was happening. An organization in the United States that has been bitten twice by this bug is NASA, the organization responsible for putting man on the moon. A few years ago, a shuttle, when the shuttle program was still in effect, the shuttle Columbia took off from Florida. And when it took off, a piece of the machine, the heat shielding, came off and hit another shield, another piece of the heat shielding. And so the engineers got together, because there had already been a horrible accident with the shuttle Challenger. They said, is anything wrong? And so this is a slide from the report that the engineering company provided to NASA about the threat, right? As you can see, it's very technical, a little bit of butt covering, and well, here's this organization that looked at the Southeast research data. Here are the possible scenarios that could happen. And when you look at it, it's like, okay, you know, so what? Particularly if this is slide 110 of 140. I'll highlight something that was buried in this slide, and we'll see if you noticed what it was. Of a poorly designed, poorly communicated, poor use of technology, people lost their lives. It would suggest to me anyway that getting the training that I suggested before. As we conclude our lesson on communication technology and organizations, I again want you to reflect on the issues that you see in your own use of technology. Is there something that you would think you need to learn to do better in terms of creating the technology and messages that go into it? Do you use your cell phone too much in checking email? Whatever the issue might be. You might not have any issues in your own use of technology, and if so, you can just write about that. This concludes the lesson on communication, technology, and organizations.